site of the Red House, which suddenly, after 8 years, is being restored at top speed. What day of the week is it? They're restoring the Red House on a Saturday. They're working literally 7 days a week. So what's going on? Are we at the other side of the looking glass? Anyway, I'm going to hand you over now to this wonderful panel for this great conversation. Enjoy it, and let's welcome them with a big round of applause.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. Let me begin with a question to Steve on my own behalf, and quite possibly everyone's behalf. Steve, you are an American ethnomusicologist based in Indiana. How come you're the person who wrote this about Port of Spain?
Well, Judy, it's nice to be here, first of all, and it's wonderful to receive this invitation from Bocas. Such an incredible festival. It's a real honor to be part of it, and to be with these three individuals to talk about one of my favorite topics, probably my favorite topic, Port of Spain. So I'm actually not an ethnomusicologist. That's my day job. I run an organization that supports research in ethnomusicology, but my background is, I studied English, I studied folklore. I've always had a broad interest in cultural history and cultural geography. So I came to Trinidad 30 years ago and lived here for a year and a half and wrote a book on steel bands. So I guess that identified me for life as a music person, and I still am heavily, love music. But I haven't been researching music for quite some time. Really, for the last 10 or 15 years, I've been focused more on the built environment. And again, I had some background in that, both from graduate school studies, and for many years I worked as a curator at a history museum in downtown Miami, where we had strong architectural collections, so my interest in architecture and geography grew during that period. So how did I write this book? Why did I write it? So again, I've been in and out of Port of Spain for 30 years, and I remember the landscape of when I use the word landscape, which is a key word within the book, I mean the entire built environment, the entire everything from streets to yards to squares to gardens to buildings of all types to monuments, anything that's material. So that's the way in which the word landscape's used in the book. It's the way cultural geographers would use it. And I remember the 1980s landscape, which looks so different than what we have present now. And by and I guess from my earliest days in Trinidad, I was always fascinated not only by the range of architectural traditions in the city, but also by the way in which people conceptualize and use space. And that's an immense topic, but just a couple of examples. Since I was in the early days researching steel bands, I was fascinated by the social and spatial organization of pan yards and their relation to communities and to streets. So there was that. But it's much more. The route taxi system is one of the most complex spatial phenomena I've ever, encountered. It requires so much traditional knowledge to know how to actually use the system appropriately, and I worked hard doing that.
What does this mean?
Sorry?
What does this mean and that?
Yeah. So you have to really know a lot. I mean, people who use it regularly understand that. It's just, implicit knowledge, but for an outsider, you have to learn the system. So it was things like that that fascinated me. And then by the, around 2004, 2005 is when I really thought I would try to write a book about Port of Spain. And by that point, we were in another building boom, right? And especially the downtown area, so much of, the old cocoa warehouses, so much was disappearing or had already disappeared. Every time I would come to Trinidad, I would photograph the city and, and I would try to keep track of houses and other buildings, and on each trip more of them were gone. So it was a disappearing city, and I knew that people like Rudylynn and Citizens for Conservation, the National Trust, and historians were working on this, but the city seemed to be changing so rapidly that I thought I would try a book. And it took me a long time to figure out how to do it. I knew I wanted to do something more. It's not an architectural history. It's not the way an architectural historian would approach the city, although it certainly deals a lot with architecture. But I wanted to capture that whole organization of space, the whole way of life surrounding, and how it's embedded in the material environment. So I went to work, both in the archives principally and the National Archives, and I really want to acknowledge the wonderful staff at the National Archives of Trinidad and Tobago who had to who for 10 years plus put up with me day after day, you know, asking for very obscure things.
Can I just ask one thing which that point raises? At what point did you realize just what a huge task you had taken on in writing this book?
I think from the beginning, I was a little scared to even get into this project. To try to take on a city of any size, it requires a lot of courage. It was only, you know, this book is long, I admit that, but it's only a tiny slice of the story of this city. You know, it starts in the cocoa boom and it ends at independence. It only actually deals with a very small fraction of the material environment, even though it's a long book. So what made it long was working at the National Archives, which is such an incredible resource. I mean, it's endless in terms of the newspaper material, government documents, maps, photographs, and other sources. And I use various other archives and libraries as well, but that was the principal one.
Yeah, I noticed in the events listing for this particular event, it talks about hidden archives. And I don't think they're really hidden, are they? They're not. I mean, people imagine that our history is hard to dig up, but if you look in the right place, it's not actually hard at all.
Yes, I was thinking a lot about that word in our panel title as well, and I think I know what the organizers were getting at, that you have to work hard to find some of this material, but no, it's not hidden. I think to write any type of history, it requires a lot of imagination. You have to try to figure out what might have happened and then where you can go for sources. So you have to, and then as you get deeper and deeper into sources, they suggest other sources, and it can be a never-ending project, and you just keep on, one lead takes you somewhere else. But no, there's a vast amount of material at the National Archives. The staff is incredibly helpful in bringing it out. But sometimes, again, there you have to think, well, where might such a building or such an event have been documented, and then know how to ask for that type of material. But the archives are not only in Trinidad. As the audience well knows, we Americans had a strong presence here during World War II, and that generated quite an archive in itself. The Army and the Navy were both here. They had civilian contractors in large numbers here as well. And Port of Spain was the hub of this massive base building initiative that involved many parts of the island. There were various bases in Port of Spain, and this was the headquarters for the Army. The Army published a newspaper. Their engineering unit had its own magazine. Right at the end of the war, 2 Army officers who were still stationed in Trinidad wrote a 5-volume typescript of their, brief experience here. And the local newspapers covered the World War II experience extensively. Some of the greatest writers of Trinidad wrote about it, from Sylvan to Naipaul to de Boissier. So there's a vast amount of material there. Some of the U.S. material is you have to go to the U.S. to find. It's these rare Army newspapers. TNT was the name of the newspaper published by the Army in Trinidad, Trinidad News Tips, TNT. It exists at New York Public Library. I was amazed to find it there. I thought that maybe some Army officer had donated his or his copies to the library, perhaps after the war. When I got to New York Public Library, I saw on the back of the newspapers the address of New York Public Library. They were subscribing to it during the war, which is amazing. But to find photographs, both the Army and the Navy took extensive photographs. There were great photographers in the Army and the Navy. The U.S. Army Signal Corps was famous for its photographers. These were people who had been professional photographers and joined in the war. So that material is all at the National Archives of the U.S., and there you have to kind of dig too. But yeah, the archives are hidden in that you have to imagine where they might be, but once you get there, it's just a matter of hard work.
Okay, Bridget, I'm sure you have a lot to say or to ask. Where would you like to begin?
Sure, thank you, Judy. Well, first let me congratulate Steve on researching and writing what really is a remarkable book. It is huge, as I think Nicholas said. It is a weighty book. My copy was so heavy I didn't even bring it here this afternoon because I didn't want to carry it around Bocas all day. But, and let me say, it is absolutely an academic book. Huge numbers of annotations and one of the longest bibliographies I've seen for a long time. But it is indeed immensely readable. And I think particularly the last two chapters, for quite a lot of older Port of Spain folks, the last two chapters are the ones that deal with the post-war period, coming up to independence. It's going to be like a nostalgia trip, because some of the chapters read like an extremely well-informed, extremely erudite guidebook. So you sort of go from street to street and building to building. So I really commend it to you all. As a historian, too, the book reflects one of the more recent trends in writing about Caribbean history, which is moving away, not moving away, but moving away from an almost exclusive focus on the plantation and the village and rural life, and moving to city history. Lloyd Best, who always got the right phrase for everything, captured it as we're moving from the plantation to the port. And of course, this is Port of Spain. So Steve's book fits in an emerging genre of Caribbean history writing, which we could loosely call urban history, and particularly the history of capital cities, because in British colonialism, now I think about it, it was true also in Spanish and French colonialism, the capital city really did dominate. And Port of Spain did dominate politically, socially, and demographically the history of Trinidad. So his book, he claims he's not a historian, all right, he's a geographer. Geography is a famously amorphous discipline, which tentacles in all directions. This is a work of social history as well as cultural geography. The question I want to ask Steve, and it relates to something that he himself said. One of the key themes that runs right through the book is the way Port of Spain's citizens negotiated for the use of public space. Now, he starts his book at the period of high colonialism, 1880s. The British Empire is at its absolute zenith. The power of Britain is unchallenged, and et cetera, et cetera. And yet, the colonial authorities never in Trinidad had it all their own way. Never. If you read the newspapers, the Trinidad newspapers of the 1880s and 1890s, it will astonish you how in a small crown colony, how much freedom of press there were. I've seen articles published, Judy, which you would hesitate to publish in today's newsday. I've seen articles libeling governors and chief justices in outrageous sort of ways. The press was remarkably free. The Trini people, Port of Spain people particularly, were difficult people. Rambunctious, they still are, so I hear. Rambunctious people. So even in the period of high colonialism, there was constant negotiation between colonial authorities, city authorities, the mayor and so forth, and different groups of the city's residents as to how public spaces should be used. So I wonder, Steve, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Oh, absolutely. That is one of the things I really try to look at, and you can take it at almost. You can start almost anywhere, from public buildings to squares to streets. But just to take the squares, Brunswick Square was renamed Woodford Square in 1917. You know, that had existed since the 19th century. But by the latter 19th, early 20th century, they were really trying to improve the square. Eventually the bandstand came, but there was more effort to improve the walks and the plantings and keep the railway, keep the fence painted and all sorts of things, because that was seen as, even then, as the key public space. And of course, it was surrounded by the colonial regime, the court, the Red House, the court, the Trinity Cathedral, the police station was a block away. So that was, in one way, it could be looked at as, this focal point of colonialism. And the square was heavily policed. There was a lot of writing in the newspapers about how to properly use the square. There was much concern about so-called beggars and loiterers and condemnation of them and trying to remove them from the square and just control the type of activities that went on there. But as you suggest, the colonial authorities could never control this population. People were always using spaces in their own way. And obviously this was apparent in the annual carnival, but in so many other ways as well, as in protests from the water riots to the 1990 labor strikes, would involve the use not only of the square and of the streets, but of the port itself, of the docks itself, which were another key center of perhaps the key center of the colonial economy, because this is where agricultural products were shipped out to the world and where manufactured goods came in. So to disrupt the docks was to cause serious disruption to the society as a whole. But and yes, the newspapers, like you, I've been amazed at what was published in the late 19th, early 20th century, just reading like Argos, for example. I mean, you could say just about anything. But there are other spaces where people were able to articulate alternative points of view. And another good example would be what used to be called the Carnival Band tents. This would be in the very first and second decade of the 20th century, when the masquerade bands would get together for a bit of time before the actual days of carnival, and back then they would rehearse songs. There would be the chantwell who would have new songs for the season, and then the members of the band would rehearse the songs. And these eventually became, the calypso tents in the 1920s and 30s. And these were key spaces for articulating points of view that were different than what was being expressed in the newspapers or through official institutions and through the schools. So, and the same with the Savannah. I mean, we think of the Savannah as an elite zone surrounded by wealthy residences, the Royal Victoria Institute, the museum, Government House, the Botanic Gardens, which were also a key symbol of British power in terms of the control of botanic wealth. But the Savannah was also a site of many protests. The Princess Building, which attracted all sorts of events, dances, and recreational events, but all kinds of people spoke at the Princess Building, including people quite with strong views against colonialism. So there were a lot of, I think the key word is negotiated. All of these spaces, it was a constant give and take between different segments of the population over how to use public space, whether it was outdoor spaces like squares and parks and streets, or even public buildings.
Well, I think that answer illustrates why this needed to be such a big book and how much more it is than just a history of the built part of Port of Spain. And there's a lot of detail about the places, but also about the people, the history of, there's several pages about the War Memorial and why it took 8 years to get that organized and decide where it should be. And then there was a squabble about which soldiers had the right to stand at the more prominent corner for the unveiling, and so on and so on. I just wanted to ask everybody, actually, perhaps beginning with you, Steve, when you were writing the book, what thing that you researched and discovered most surprised or interested you?
So we were just talking about the tensions in the society, because this was a society with profound inequality. So there were ongoing tensions that were expressed in all sorts of ways, and whether it was through the press or through calypso or through just talk on the streets. But I think what most struck me in reading through old newspapers and other source material was a rhetoric, what I would call it in the book, a rhetoric of progress. There was this feeling of forward momentum in the city among just about everybody who was at least writing. Who we could find, modernity, a record of modernity, the sense of forward movement that people came to the city for all manner of reasons, but most people felt they could improve themselves in some way in the city, economically or in other ways. All the different political groups had some vision that they could change the society, in a positive fashion. And there was also a lot of interest in improving the city. I talked a little bit about, the efforts to improve Woodford Square. That's just one small example. There was a constant expression in the press and other documents that, well, first of all, there was a feeling that Port of Spain was not as well known as and appreciated as it should be, that it was actually a much more important city in the Caribbean than a lot of people understood. So the city leaders were constant, what we sometimes called boosterism. They were constantly trying to push the status of the city. But it was more than that. There was even though there were all these tensions in the society, there was strong civic consciousness. People felt that they were part of a single, at least a lot of people felt they were part of a single community, that through collective efforts, the city and the society could be better. And I guess that's one of the things that struck me the most, because given the extreme social inequality, I didn't necessarily expect to hear that type of language in so many documents.
Okay, let's turn to Rudylynn next. Out of everything in the book, what struck you about it most, or was there anything that surprised you about it?
Well, I want to just tell Stephen thank you, and it was this is amazing, particularly for planners and architects. I am of course looking at it from that focus. The thing about this book is that for every street, every neighborhood, every district, there's a story. And that is what that's one of the things I found fascinating about it. You brought out the reason for the development and how people felt about it at the time and how people lived in the area and what the buildings looked like. And that, to me, was incredible, because normally, if you look at something like this, when I first looked at it, I thought it was going to be really about buildings and construction, and only to find out there's just as much social history and just as many interesting stories about individuals and about people in this book, which helps to create the whole atmosphere and the mood. I liked the way you balanced the two. I liked that this is now almost a one-stop shop for information. A lot of students can now come and just open this book and find the correct page, and everything about that neighborhood is in the book. And I'm amazed that you went into so much detail. It's really quite incredible. I am also particularly interested in your book about the way the transition from the colonial architecture to the modern architecture. And I feel as architects and planners, we are all interested in how the city developed from the old Spanish days coming forward, and you've done a very good job in documenting that. Even to the point of talking about Trinity Cathedral was originally built in the middle of Woodford Square. I mean, I don't know how many people know that. And I was delighted to see that in here, because it again goes back to how we have a way of getting our own way a lot of times. Really, what happened is the people just objected to that, and they felt it's a public square, and why should one denomination dominate and control? No, and protest and riot, whatever, And eventually, the Governor Woodford had to relent and dismantle it brick by brick, block by block, stone by stone, and rebuild it in a new place. So all through the book, we see this, and for everything, we fight for things, we quarrel, we fuss, and we generally come out on top. Not always, but we kind of get what we want a lot of times. And what amazed me too was that I'm reading it and I'm saying, well, what's different now? It's the same things happening, just in a different era, and the same sort of quarrels. We worried about the garbage on the road, we worried about the vagrants, it's all in the book, and these were problems even in early Port of Spain. So I found all of that quite interesting. One of the things that I wanted you to address is the whole town and country planning. the introduction of town and country planning and how that came about and what effect it had
Right.
on the city.
So in the cocoa boom era, the main individuals who would have been in charge of what we call town planning would have been the director of public works for the central government and the city engineer. And by the way, working on this study, I developed a great respect and interest in engineers, not just architects. I don't know if there are any engineers in the audience, but engineers as well as architects had such a profound impact on the city. The city engineer for years, was responsible for improvements in roads and the water supply and paving the dry river and building the Trinidad War Memorial, even though it was designed by a fellow from England, Louis Frederick Rosslyn. It was actually under the direction of the city government to build the Trinidad War Memorial in 1924. So for a long time, these people weren't called town planners, but it was, engineers and architects and other public servants who were dealing with town planning issues and all the problems that Rudylynn pointed out. I mean, we all now are concerned about the water supply. Well, of course, they were really concerned about the water supply in the late 19th and early 20th century, and they burned down the Red House in part because of it. But by the 1920s, there start to be a few articles in the paper saying, this city is growing really fast. So that's one of the things that happened, during the period I was looking at from the 1880s to independence. I mean, the city was really, really growing quickly, and then it kind of peaked in population just about when I end, at independence. But with that many people moving into the city, the incorporation of outlying districts, keep in mind that Belmont and Woodbrook, or St. Clair weren't part of the city proper initially. They got annexed to the city during the early 20th century. St. James was added a little bit longer, some other districts. So with the expansion of the city, with people moving from the central city out into some of these other districts while others were moving in with all manner of housing problems in the central city, barrack yards. We can talk more about those later. All this became clear by the 1920s that there needed to be more systematic agency for dealing with all these complexities. So then by the 1930s, the central government, the colonial government, started assembling some of the people I mentioned, engineers, officials from the central government, from the Port of Spain government, from the San Fernando government, a couple of architects, brought in a town planner from England because, by the 30s, town planning was becoming a much more academic discipline. There was a body of thought. And by the end of the 1930s, there was the first legislation for town and country planning. And it controlled anything beyond a single plot, that there were now regulations you had to follow and permissions that needed to be obtained in terms of doing just about anything. And that continued for, that particular act was passed in the late 1930s. That continued for a while and eventually was determined to be inadequate. And another town and planning bill was passed in the early 1960s, which had much more authority behind it and gave central government officials the ability to control space and what we think of as zoning and that type of thing in a much more vigorous fashion. And this was something of great interest to the P&M government. They put a lot more emphasis into town and country planning. And of course, they were also interested not only in the city itself, but trying to take a national approach because by this time, so much the East-West corridor was developing. So it became clear that town and country planning had to be an island-wide phenomenon. And so there were conferences, there were publications, and the new legislation and new officials. And Williams, I think Williams had the town planner, the official, within his own within his own ministry, office, so that he could keep close tabs on all of this.
Okay, well, Bridget, we all know that you know everything there is to know about the history of not only Port of Spain, but the whole country. So I'm sure nothing in the book surprised you, but was there anything that particularly interested you? Any viewpoints or any events that Steve dealt with that particularly intrigued you?
There were events, but But what I wanted to draw the audience attention to is that one of the things that Steve is interested in is not just the history of the city, what was happening in the city and how the city developed, but how it was represented, the representation of the city and the way the city was changing. So, for example, he analyzes the visual, the pictorial representations of the city, maps, plans, insurance maps, architects' plans, drawings, sketches, paintings, etc. And by the way, the book is very well illustrated. There are, one of the reasons why it's not a particularly cheap book is that there are many, many illustrations which depict not only the iconic buildings, but many other aspects of the development of the city. And by the way, making a plug for UWI here, I'm delighted to see that many of the illustrations come from the Michael Goldberg, a wonderful collection. We have a UWI library, the Michael Goldberg collection of postcards and photographs. But he's equally interested in the verbal or written representations of the city. The descriptions in the newspapers, the correspondence, the letters to the editor. He's interested in how travel writers, one of the huge resources for writing 19th and 20th century Caribbean history is a very rich literature of travel writers. Now, a lot of them were ignorant and prejudiced and so on, but they were often extremely interesting. He draws on that literature and fictional representations of the city. So we're here at a Lit Fest, and I'm pleased to be able to tell you there is literature in the book. Now, as a historian, I would have used all of that as my source, but I wouldn't have gone out of my way to attempt to analyze the ways in which the city was represented. So I wanted to ask Steve, why did that seem to you an important aspect of your history?
Right, so you can learn a lot just by studying the actual material environment, walking around. You can learn a lot from maps and architectural drawings and from photographs. But if you're really interested in the intersection, the interrelationship between social structures and processes and spatial structures and processes, you need to understand how people talk about places. So from the very beginning, I realized that that was going to have to be part of the study, not just analyzing the material environment, not just analyzing how people lived within and moved within that environment, but how they talked about it. So yeah, all the sources that you mentioned were invaluable. The newspaper is by far the richest. I mean, I can't say for all of you who are involved in research or in history or might want to, the newspapers is just an incredible wealth of material. And every newspaper is a snapshot of the society at a point in time. You learn as much from the advertisements as you do from the, the editorials or the letters or the actual articles. So all of that. And yes, the travel literature, it varies immensely. Some people were only here for a day and, were pretty much clueless, but they still had observations. And others spent a while and were amazingly perceptive for not being from here. But the fiction is perhaps the richest of all. I mean, there's nothing like, reading a C.L.R. James or an Alfred Mendes short story to try to understand what the late 1920s or early 30s were like, or, reading a V.S. Naipaul or Samuel Selvin novel to find out what the 40s were like. Because all of these authors talk at length about places. I mean, obviously story plots are embedded in particular locales, but they tend to be, they describe places. They give a sense of, if you read Selvin, if you, A Brighter Sun, a lot of the action's out in Barataria, but there's much talk about what Port of Spain means and going into Port of Spain and what it's like to go into Port of Spain. So I found all that kind of material really, really useful. And Port of Spain, like any city, has just attracted a wide range of commentators over the years. I mean, it's a port city, it's a capital city. tourists were coming down here from the late 19th century. The tourists of the late 19th century were very different than the day. These were very wealthy people. Was a small number of people. And some of them seem to have had business interests. So, coming for leisure was sometimes combined with looking for business opportunities. But they generated some of this travel literature that you're talking about. And then the U.S. Army and Navy, again, especially the Army, which had more publications. I didn't find as many publications from the Navy. But the Army troops, which ranged, from just the enlisted men to officers, a lot of the officers were fascinated by this city, and they tried to figure it out, and they were, very intrigued by Trinidad. They took pictures. They would write, their articles in their newspaper are not only about what's going on within the Army and their endless dances and carousing they had, and they also talked about, they were also very interested in what they were building. Keep in mind there's a lot of building going on. It's not just docksite. All of Nelson Mandela Park, which was then King George V Park, was an Army base. So, they were taking, anytime they needed more land, they would pretty much just take it. I mean, they had to get permission from the central or town government, but they would take land. So there was a lot of construction going on. They covered that. But they were fascinated by Trinidad culture. They wrote about it endlessly. They wrote short stories and poems. They had cartoons about Trinidad. I mean, it fascinated them. So all of that gives you, that's another really valuable source to understand perceptions of space. So one way to think about a city, one way to think about a built environment is that it's an ongoing conversation, not only in terms of forms that are built in different forms, respond to earlier forms, but it's also an ongoing conversation in terms of verbal commentary and pictorial commentary. So you have to kind of capture as much of that ongoing dialogue as possible to really understand the city. And in a way, I see this book as just another statement in that ongoing conversation.
Well, I'm quite happy to admit that there was one part of it which surprised me, which you just touched on. I mean, of course, I was aware of the American presence during the war, and people know about Dockside and Waterfield and, of course, Chaguaramas. But the way they occupied the whole of what was then King George V Park, perhaps you could talk a little bit about exactly what happened there and what happened afterwards.
Right. So in the city, Whitehall served as the headquarters of the Army. As Judy mentioned, the biggest Army base was Fort Reed out, to the southeast of Arima, and that just one part of Fort Reed was Waller Field. That's become kind of the best known because it was a major U.S. Army Air Corps, airfield. But there was lots more going on in Fort Reed than just Waller Field. They had bases all over. Carlson Field down in Central. They had smaller bases down the islands. But Whitehall was the hub of the Army's administration. But if that was sort of the administrative center, the nerve center was Dockside, because that's where ships were coming in with troops, but endless supplies of materials. I mean, the scale of construction, which happened very quickly, the Army built most of its structures in about a year or two. So they not only imported all of this material, they were bringing in bulldozers and train cars and all kinds of heavy machinery. So endless material was coming through Dockside. Troops were coming through Dockside. First it was called Tent City because a lot of people lived in tents, and the tents seemed to have lasted quite a while, but eventually they started building barracks there. But in the early days of Dockside, it was, I should say that the first troops came in about April, May of 1941. Right before rainy season, and then rainy season descended on the place, and Dockside turned into a grand sea of mud. And the general at the time figured there's no way he was going to have his headquarters in a sea of mud. He actually says this. There's no way they're going to respect us if my office is down up Dockside. So I need a better place. So that's when he moved up to Whitehall. At Whitehall before, there had been the U.S. Army Engineering Unit. So those were architects and engineers who were responsible for the vast base building effort around the island. They got pushed out. The general pulled rank and pushed the engineers out. They went to the School for the Blind. They took over that building. So then the general was up there. But so Dockside was becoming really crowded, and they felt they needed a better looking base than that. So there was beautiful King George V park, and they eventually, the city controlled the park. They eventually promised the city they wouldn't take down it, they wouldn't destroy any trees, but they got possession of the entire park, and they actually built a really nice looking base there. Not only did they preserve all the trees, they put in gardens, they had nice walkways, they had a parade field in the middle, they had a movie theater at one end so that the sound was an open air movie theater so the sounds wouldn't disturb people sleeping, troops sleeping at night. The radio station, WVDI, some of the older members of the audience may remember the U.S. Armed Forces radio. It came out of there, because the radio station was very important. It broadcast not only a lot of music and news from the U.S., but they were very interested in local news and music. Many Calypsonians appeared on the radio station. Local people listened to the radio. All that was coming out of what they called St. Clair Cantonment. And it was like St. Clair. It was supposed to be a more upscale base. And they just tried to create a better profile, a higher profile for how people perceived the Army. And then I'll just say real quickly that at the end of the war, there was some debate because they had quite a few buildings. There were not only barracks, there were other kind of buildings. There was some debate what to do with the buildings. They were well made. And there was thought, well, maybe it could become a medical center. And there was, for a year or so, some discussion of that. But in the end, they were just all taken down. I'm not exactly sure what happened to that discussion, why they weren't repurposed, but the buildings all disappeared. So you can walk through Nelson Mandela Park now and not know that an entire town, it looked like a town. I mean, it was really well organized. A whole town had existed there. And there's a passage in Naipaul's Miguel Street. I think it's the barber, was it Bobo the barber? Bobo the barber, I believe it was the name of the barber. He knew that the war was over when, he said he knew the war was over when the buildings disappeared from King George V Park.
One other thing that comes through very clearly in the book is that you seem to share this view of the inhabitants, at least in the past, about the city making progress and being forward-moving and so on. Rudylynn, I don't know if you would like to comment on that, to say whether you agree with it, and maybe then, Steve, you could explain and defend that view.
The city was forward-moving. I don't think that anybody debates that. Is it still? That's a whole other conversation. Throughout the book, he talks about the expansion of the different neighborhoods, etc. There was a lot about around the savannah and those kinds of areas. Not as much about Belmont, for instance. And I wondered if it was that information was difficult to get. That you didn't find too much in the archives or what, but that was one observation that I made. I also noted your comments about the way we have kept the names, the original names of most of our streets and parks and whatnot. Lord Harris Square, Columbus Square, all these sorts of things. We've changed some, but there's still quite a few of them like that. And I wondered if you had anything more that you could say about that.
So to answer a couple of your first points, there was this sense of energy, dynamism with this city. And again, I end at 1962. So what happens after 1962 is really another story, and hopefully somebody will write that story.
The next volume.
Not me. Somebody else can do that one. But up until 1962, there was this sense of improvement. And there were the tram lines, which was actually a very efficient form of transportation. They were introduced with electricity in 1895. And this was one of the really early tram line systems in the Caribbean and Latin America. And so there was cocoa wealth that enabled this to happen. So there was much excitement about having electricity in the city, having this efficient system of tram lines, being able to to ride to different districts. That helped to integrate different neighborhoods. And in so many other spheres, there was a sense of forward momentum. The movie theaters, the cinemas were hugely important. And there have been screening of movies from the early first decade of the 20th century. But it was in the 30s that, you have what was the Metro for 1 year and became the Globe and the Roxy and the Deluxe. And these all had the latest technology. So there was, again, this sense of forward momentum. And as Rudylynn, as you mentioned a little bit earlier, we've run out of time almost, but the topic of modernism and modern architecture in Port of Spain is immensely important. It really took off in the 30s. One of the first figures was Herbert Brinsley, who was an English architect. But he lived here for a long period of time, and he embraced the society, embraced its built environment, its aesthetic. He designed everything from the Neil and Massey garage on Edward Street, the Alston building on Marine Square. The Treasury building was one of his masterpieces. So again, modern architecture, since it didn't reference the European past, it offered a sense of a future that wasn't encumbered by colonialism. So all this was part of the forward momentum. But you're right. Again, I want to emphasize there was extreme inequality within the city throughout the period that I address. By the end of the 1930s, as much as half of the population lived in barrack yards, which incredibly cramped, incredibly poor housing conditions. Many other people lived in self-built structures. So yeah, if you were living under those circumstances, whether this rhetoric of progress, it surely wouldn't have been articulated as much as it was being articulated in the newspapers. But to answer your final point, I don't deal as much with what I'm calling the surrounding districts. Most of the book deals with the central city, downtown and uptown, and the Queens Park, Savannah area. And for two reasons. One, those are kind of central to my argument, which is about how colonialism and decolonization work at the ground level as actually part of the built environment, about how people orient themselves in space. So, so many of the public buildings are within that area. Actually, so much of the population for much of this period lived in the central city. So many people were packed within the barrack yards. But yes, all of East Dry River, all of Belmont, all of Woodbrook, St. James. These are all immensely important places, and I tried to deal with them to an extent. But you're right. I was limited by space. I was also limited. I never found as much in the archives about East Dry River in particular, and that was my biggest regret. I would have liked to have included much, much more about the eastern districts, and that's a definite limitation of the book, and I hope somebody else writes that book.
Okay, I'm sure our large and enthusiastic audience has things they would like to say and ask. There's a microphone which will be brought round, maybe starting over here.
It's okay. Thank you very much, Mrs. Stuempfle. And I'm glad to hear from you.
No, it's being recorded.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for that extraordinary. We're all very, very interested in it. In your book, there are many good pictures, but there's an extraordinary one of East Dry River. You just mentioned it. And it looks very genteel. It looks very genteel. These discrete French houses on wide plots of land. It's of Calvary Hill. It's wooded and everything. But by the 1950s, there's this movie, Fire Down Below, and Rita Hayworth is coming down these concrete steps. So it's all gone by 1957. Bridget had mentioned that your interest is not just in architecture, but in why things happen. What was the date of that photo, if you can remember it? And what was it, what happened to how did we grow? Did we grow from the barracks and we went east? What happened to that neighborhood?
So that photo, courtesy to Jerry Besson for that photo. It's Cocoa Boom era, late 19th, early 20th century. Yeah, and there were it's not only that immediate Calvary Hill area. There were other parts. There was a neighborhood right to the east of the Dry River. It would have been above. It would have been above Queen Street. That had really, and you can learn about this from the insurance map of 1895. It had high-quality houses in there, so again, before before people started, moving into Belmont and Woodbrook, people of all, economic levels were in the central city and creating housing according to their means. So a lot of places where we would today not expect to see quite impressive houses, there were, during the cocoa boom era. But the area, the whole central city became more and more crowded during the cocoa boom era and during the interwar era, between the two world wars. As more and more people were coming in, especially people of lesser means, those with money were starting to look for ways of getting out. More middle-class people moved into Belmont or Woodbrook. People with even more money headed for St. Anne's or Maraval and Cascade. So those structures probably existed for a while, but were not kept up, and eventually, it's interesting to hear your observation that by the 30s, those particular ones were gone. But I think it's that movement of people and changing economic assets that has a lot to do with it.
But there's 2 houses left.
And there are 2
houses left.
There are 2 left, yeah. Oh, still to this day, you can go down, you can go in various parts of East Dry River and find, cocoa boom, very nice cocoa boom houses. Yeah, I'm talking in broader terms, yeah.
Okay, other questions? The lady at the back. Microphone.
Thank you. Yes, extremely enjoyable, Stephen. Thank you. I'm interested, as I know so many here are, in the aspects of the development of Carnival in the Barrack yards. Did you find any descriptions, not necessarily of Carnival development, but of the Barrack yards themselves, about their form or about what other activities took place in them and all the rest of it?
Endless descriptions. Endless descriptions. We all know a lot from fiction, but I would say the best source are the newspapers. The Port of Spain Gazette during the early 20th century wrote about barrack yards endlessly, and the yards were widely condemned by writers to the paper, whether they were editorials or letters to the editor. These yards, again, this was where a large portion of the city lived. The conditions were terrible. An entire household in a 10 to 12 foot, 10 to 12 square foot space. Could be 4 or 5 or more people in that one room, each household in a single room, shared standpipe and latrine. Terrible, terrible conditions. But outsiders, then demonize the people living under those conditions, describe them as a threat to public health, to public order, to public morality. So especially by, between 1910 and 1920, if you look in the Port of Spain Gazette, editorial after editorial describing in detail what's going on in the barrack yards, what happened on a certain night, it would often, and it blamed the dwellers for everything, even though, landlords were enriching themselves, because the rents were actually quite high in the barrack yards. The landlords were enriching themselves. There was endless talk about we need to get rid of the barrack yards. They're a disgrace, but of course, some members of the city council were barrack yard landlords, so that moved slowly. And, but yeah, it's amazing how much detail is in the Gazette. They describe the activities. They're describing them from a point of view to condemn them, and a lot of it's about morality and public health, but they get into the details of what's going on in there. But we also all know that, okay, the conditions were terrible in the barrack yards, but these were also spaces that allowed strong social networks to develop that became places of community building, places of artistic creativity, not just Carnival, but including Carnival, so that even, by the 30s, when the city was getting more, and the central government were getting more serious about building other types of housing, out at Gonzales Place. So Gonzales Place, the 100 houses out at Gonzales Place, which many are still there, those houses were done in 1936. The idea was, the city was now doing what it called slum clearance on the east side of downtown. They tried to get, they targeted a few blocks of people to move to those 100 houses at Gonzales Place. People didn't want to move. In part, a lot of people didn't want to move, in part because they couldn't afford the rents that were going to be charged out at Gonzales Place, in part because it was a remote area, it was much more convenient to be in town, but also in part because they had these strong social networks and communities within the yards. Now, ultimately, they moved out.
Just to say, there's an excellent short book by James Cummings, which is on-the-ground detailed insider sociology of the Port of Spain barrack yards in the 1930s and 40s. I forget the title now. Did you? Barrack Yard Dwellers by James Cummings. It's short but excellent, and unlike the newspaper perspective, this is a perspective, an insider perspective, a man who as a young man and a boy lived in a barrack yard.
Okay, Abigail, I know you've been waiting a long time.
I just am curious, did you come across any information on Trinidad's indigenous people in Port of Spain when you were researching, and what and how, were they living any indigenous people in Port of Spain, and is there any information in this book on it?
So I just touch on that briefly because I start in 1888. But yes, there were indigenous settlements here, certainly at Mucurapo, and certainly in what's now Independence Square. The city is in the Red House. Yeah, this whole area. I mean, this whole area had indigenous settlement, and for a while. During the 15 and 1600s, the city, it took a little while to settle from Mucurapo to what's now Independence Square as where Port of Spain was going to develop from. But yes, this whole area had indigenous people, and I think one of the.
Did you mean now?
No, but what I was trying to understand is when you were doing the research, what were the communities like then?
Oh, yeah, that would be outside.
And the building structures,
Yeah. That would be outside the periods, since I started with the cocoa boom. But a good source for some of that would be John Noel Lewis's architectural history called Ajupa. He deals with some of that. But just one other note, I think it's wonderful that when the new town hall, the town hall on the north side of Woodford Square burned down in the late 1940s, and took a long time to get a new town hall. But when it finally opened in 1961, a beautiful new building designed by an important local firm, Pryor, Lorenco, and Nago. This is getting back to modernism. And there's a whole story of Trinidad modernism, and some people have written about this. Your brother, Mark Raymond, and others. But that was a beautiful new building. I think it's so important that Carlisle Chang was commissioned to do the mural at the back of the courtyard there, and study the imagery of that mural. Okay, it's sure he references the Spanish, the British, but so many of the images are of the indigenous people. So this is 1961. This is a year before independence. So the message seemed, one of the many messages of that fantastic mural is, there was a community here before the Spanish and the British came, and there's going to be a civic, there's going to be a community and a civic order here when they're gone. So it was really a powerful statement at the time of independence.
Okay, I think maybe we could take one last quick question. Rhoda?
Thank you. Yes. One of the interesting things about that Barrack Yard Dwellers book, and from other sources, is that Port of Spain was also an entry point for migrants. And I just wanted to know whether you say anything about this in this book, and how these migrant communities eventually become like the new Port of Spainians or Trinidadians, etc.
I'll let Bridget and the others say more. There are people constantly coming in to the city from other places, from other islands, from Venezuela. If you read the newspapers of the cocoa boom era, they're constantly talking about Venezuelans residing in the hotels or other places downtown. So yeah, a lot of the character of Port of Spain involves this constant movement of people into the city from other places, as well as from the countryside of Trinidad. That's where a lot of its character comes from. And it's that constant interaction of people from many different places, which I think has a lot to do with the dynamism and creativity and the creation of new communities that you point to. And you probably have more to say about that.
No, but what I did want to say, since I know time is up, is that the last two chapters of Steve's book, which deal with the town planning era and the era of modernist architecture for independence and so on, remembering where we are right now, can we just pay respect to the late, great Colin Laird, who not only designed and built this wonderful building, but also perhaps the most iconic building of independence, Queen's Hall. So enough respect to Mr. Laird.
Yes, Colin Laird was so immensely important. I would like to mention just one other name. I got word a couple days ago that Oswald Glean Chase has also passed away, who was another very important modernist. Yeah.
Okay, unfortunately, this session was obviously way too short, but I believe Steve is going to be signing books. So if you have things you want to tell or more likely ask him, you can still do that afterwards while he's doing that. Rudylynn, you had one more thing you wanted to say.
Well, I just wanted to go back to the comment about the First Peoples. If everybody remembers that the St. Anne's River used to run through Woodford Square, and so right here where we are now was a settlement where people lived. First Peoples, they lived right here, and we've dug up a lot of artifacts under the Red House, pottery shards and actual bodies, bones. So that site for quite a long time was empty. If you go back to all the old maps and whatnot, all around Port of Spain was being built up except for that site. So it seems to me that the colonial masters understood very well it was a burial ground, and it only indicates the disrespect for the indigenous people at the time when they were establishing themselves and expanding Port of Spain, and they decided to build two monumental buildings that were very permanent in their design that said, we are here, we in charge, and this is our place. So that's just a little background bit of information.
Okay, on that note, let me thank our knowledgeable panel, Rudylynn Roberts, Professor Brereton. Thank you all for coming, and of course, most of all, for the gift of this book. Thank you, Steve.